Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the New Orchid Show. Today I'm interviewing a fascinating guest. Her name is Sinead Murphy, and among many different intellectual things she does in her busy life, she also writes for Brownstone Institute. For those of you who do not know what Brownstone is, please do take a look at the show notes for this episode where you'll find a link that will take you to their website. Now, back in November 2023, Brownstone published Sinead's editorial titled Beware the Autism-Friendly City. There was a twofold reason why this title caught my attention. Number one, it's simple but exquisitely crafted to do just that, capture attentions. And two, it was at a time where I was looking into shocking numbers of autism and other chronic conditions reported in particularly technologically advanced developed economies. What do I mean by shocking, you may ask? So let me briefly explain the state of play as it is now in 2024. Couple of important caveats for transparency before we open the floodgates. 1. Tracking the rates of autism around the world, according to official sources, is challenging for a few reasons. Main one being that there are no specific uniform criteria for assessing this condition. One cannot confirm the case of autism with a blood test, a brain scan, or any other objective technical method. Autism cases are diagnosed through clinical observation by an expert and are focused on person's behavior. It is also worth mentioning that the official narrative, as supported by various health institutions all over the world, now uniformly claims that the spike in numbers, specifically over the last 30 years, can be primarily attributed to the improvements in diagnostic methods. So think about that for a second. 2. Even if the medical industry had a piece of technology to facilitate a simple yes-no test, many nations who are reporting numbers to global health agencies lack funding and resources to conduct quality assessments. This makes the interpretation of data an absolute minefield due to inconsistencies and incongruencies embedded in the data collecting process. 3. Many nations, especially underdeveloped ones, do not bother tracking and reporting their autism rates, which adds to the problem of causal correlation. In this vacuum of reporting and clear data, it is very easy to get hijacked by analysis bias. 4. In order to make sense of the situation, one has to lean on a data and statistical analysis that happens to be the most mature. And the most mature data can be found in countries where prevalence of autism has absolutely gone through the roof over the last 30 years. Modern, developed economies of Europe, North America, places like Australia, New Zealand, places where tons of money is being spent on healthcare. 5. Data sources in the regions and countries I have just mentioned, despite the maturity grade, are not quite congruent. So if you find yourself doing a deep dive, I do recommend you look at different sources and be open-minded enough to engage with diverse points of view. That said, dogma and hyperdeterminism probably should be ignored, as nothing is truly settled when it comes to causes and trends. The subject matter is so complex and nuanced that we could be adding additional caveats here, but for the sake of not muddying the waters further, and at this latitude of simple presentation, we'll just draw the line here. Now let's have a look at the landscape. Around 1 in 36 children has been diagnosed with autism in the United States, according to the recent CDC data. The prevalence of autism in the United States has increased by 119.4% between 2000 and 2018, from 1 in 150 to 1 in 36. The prevalence of autism in Canada increased by 66.7% between 2006 and 2016, from 1 in 150 to 1 in 66. In Australia, the prevalence of autism has increased by 63.3% between 1998 and 2015, from 1 in 166 to 1 in 100. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics Survey of Disability, Aging and Carers, SDAC figures, in 2003, 30,400 Australians had autism. That number has risen to 64,600 by 2009, and in 2012, that number stood at 115,400. The first studies of the prevalence of autism, which were conducted in 1960s and 70s in both Europe and United States, reported prevalence estimates in the range of 2 to 4 cases per 10,000 children. We can go a little bit further back in time, where some sources show that in 1950s it was estimated that 1 in 25,000 children was diagnosed with autism. Currently, around 1% of the world's population has autism spectrum disorder. That's more than 75 million people, according to the research conducted by the CDC. Boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. The cost of caring for autistic Americans reached $268 billion in 2015 and could increase to $461 billion by 2025. Specifically, around 175 to 196 billion each year for adults and 61 to 66 billion each year for children. If these numbers don't shock you, I'm not quite sure what will. This problem is growing fast, and it's not going to go away unless we do something about it. Unless we understand what combination of conditions, genetic or environmental or both, is creating this terrifying prevalence trend, we are going to reach a civilization terminating event sooner than we all think. So, with all of that in mind, let us go back to the aforementioned editorial, Beware the Autism-Friendly City. Why, I thought, what is wrong with trying to be an autism-friendly city? I read the piece and instantly understood why Sinead, the author, wanted us to be cautious and question the seemingly innocent ideas of the state coming into our lives not as harmless recommendations which we can individually consider, but as mandated impositions we can never question. I've reached out to Sinead with a few questions, and in her response she also told me that she's putting finishing touches on her first book titled Autistic Society Disorder. She was very kind to share her manuscript with me, and after reading that, I thought I absolutely have to interview her and discuss the ideas and observations contained in her book, and this is what the following interview is essentially about. It is my personal opinion based on the first read of the manuscript, but I thought the book is really well written, in a sublime style which reminded me of Ivan Illich, who's an intellectual hero of mine. This is a 2-hour interview, and we cover quite a lot of ground in it. We talk about autism, about the delusions of the administrative state, about obsessive pursuit of total safety, and what it does to society, as well as many other interesting themes. I really hope you enjoy listening to it, and I hope you learn something from it. And now, without further ado, I'll give you Sinead Murphy. Sinead Murphy, very warm welcome. I'm super happy to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this conversation for weeks. There's a lot to talk about, and the subject matter is quite complicated and nuanced, so I'd say let's just get straight into it and start with a little synthesis of your biography. So how about you tell us who you are and what you do?
So my name is Sinead Murphy. And I work at home now. I mean, not from home, but at home. I used to be a lecturer in philosophy, mostly at Newcastle University, I live in Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And so my background is in philosophy, and that is what I've spent my professional life at, writing philosophy, teaching philosophy, etc. I'm, for personal reasons, have a disabled son, and also for reasons of the um, sudden degradation of the conditions of teaching at a university, which happened during and after COVID, and I don't think have really lifted. The whole situation became untenable. So I quit just over 3 years ago. So now I'm free of that institution, which is good because I never regarded it highly, and I've written a few books, one of which is entitled Zombie University, which I published in 2017. I'm rather proud to have, anticipated not quite the worst of what has happened, but at least some of it. Um, so yeah, my background in philosophy, I mean, is continental European philosophy generally, and aesthetics, hermeneutics, the question of judgment, the conditions under which we exercise our faculty of judgment is the kind of philosophical question of all others that I have found most interesting, and that I carry forward, even now as a kind of philosophical framework for understanding what is happening to us in the world. And I suppose, certainly prior to, for many years, I have attempted to bring my philosophical interests to bear on worldly problems or situations, rather than, addressing kind of discrete philosophical questions in a kind of remote academic way, which I did begin by doing in my academic life. But now, I mean, I cannot imagine doing anything else. I mean, the problems are pressing, and in whatever manner one can, one must intervene, I think.
Indeed, the problems are pressing, and I'm really glad good quality people like yourself are reacting to these problems. Anyway, I found your work on Brownstone Institute a couple of months ago when I came across the editorial titled Beware the Autism-Friendly City, and it really stopped me in my tracks because I thought, that's a very interesting selection of a title. So, could you please summarize the piece for us and explain what provoked you to write an article in the first place, and how did you pick that title?
Um, well, I've learned in my kind of new semi career of publishing articles that I wish to be read and appreciated by as wide a section of the public as possible. Because this is actually quite a contrary aim. If you've come from academia, most academics write, and they write for their bubble and the people who will also share the kind of register that they're writing within. And I have found the task of trying to capture the attention of a wider audience to be very challenging. But one of the things I've learned is that you need to have a good title, right? And even that's harder than one thinks, um, so the title is, I suppose, intended to surprise and catch the attention, because what could be bad about being autism friendly, right? And what could be negative about a city attempting to be more friendly to autistic people? But and yet, the article that comes after that title is an attempt to show how strategies of inclusion, in this case of inclusion of those with autism, that they are best understood as an operation on the population at large, and as a way of managing the population at large. Um, One of the points I make in that article is that the very nature of autism, for those who really have it, is that you are immune to strategizing. You can't benefit from it. Especially strategies that are put in place by institutions and cities and top down, anonymous kinds of strategies. So the idea that this would benefit sort of children with autism is nonsense. So what is it for? And one of the questions, I get this from my early exposure to the work of Foucault. And his point, he made it with regard to the prison, but I think it's a structurally significant move to make. His point is, how long do we keep saying, why don't prisons work? Why don't prisons work? Prisons are failing. We need to reform prisons. And why not start asking, hang on a minute, what are prisons good at? Maybe that's what they're for. And similarly, if you look at these inclusion strategies, they're constantly being reassessed and they're not being inclusive enough. We need to reform them. Hang on a minute. What are those strategies actually good at? What are they succeeding at? Because maybe that's what they're for. And in that article, I tried to show how, strategies for including those with autism will fail, of course, at including those with autism, but will be very good at, further advancing the dismantling of social life, of public life, um, in a city. in this case, because it was a result of the declaration by the Lord Mayor of Dublin that there was a new initiative about making Dublin an autism-friendly city. So, I mean, that's the thrust of the article in short.
Yeah, in the piece you talk about the ever increasing drive in us humans to nurture and look after our children, providing an easy way for the state to maybe increase and accelerate the absolute surveillance of citizens. That's a big foundational piece of that editorial as well. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, um, so I mean, the problem, I suppose, with this encouragement of people in a very hyperbolic manner to nurture, okay, yes, children, the disabled, the marginalized, the old. I mean, it's rolled out in many directions. But the problem is that it taps into what is a fundamental good in people, but it turns it against people. And one of the ways that it does that is that it recasts or reframes the nurture or care of people as the keeping of people safe. And so safety comes to replace care and nurture, as if it's somehow the same as that, or in fact, as if keeping people safe is the most careful we can be of them. And what is not foregrounded is, in fact, the way in which the pursuit of safety militates against nurture and care. One of the great things about the COVID event was that it foregrounded that. It foregrounded how anathema, in fact, the pursuit of safety is to the exercise of care and nurture. And I mean, one of the ways that this works is that, and this becomes obvious if one cares for example, a disabled child, is that the care is scaffolded by state institutions, by professionals, in terms of very abstract concepts and very anonymous kinds of strategy. And because this is coming from the professionals, from the institutions, over and over again, I see people apply to those strategies and attempt to implement them in their own homes with their own children. Um, and actually, uh, you know, how would I say, second guessing what might be a much more fulsome and nurturing understanding of their own child and interaction with their own child. So what you have is with the promotion of this this kind of society of safety, you have the opening up of a space even between mother and child, for example, and into that space come all the strategies and the abstract concepts that are delivered by professions professionals and institutions and state bodies. And this, of course, becomes a very powerful way of controlling those relationships, of managing them. And it also makes people feel helpless and apply even more enthusiastically and desperately, really, to those strategies and concepts. So it's a terribly, how would I say, kind of dispiriting, um, vicious circle, really, where you get increased helplessness and therefore increased appeal to these strategies and therefore increased helplessness and so on. And all of a sudden you have a state mediated relationship occurring within a family home between a mother and her child, or her aging parent, or something of that kind. So the idea that these relationships are natural and somehow immune to interference with, this is a fiction, unfortunately.
That connects to something else that you call out in the article as well, which is the state's increasing propensity for biochemical interference with healthy populations, which obviously does include children as well. What do you think has caused this trend to become so apparent over the last decade, especially if you look at the madness of the last 3, 4, 5 years? What do you think is happening there?
Over the last 4 or 5 years, again, what has been um, brought to the fore has been the kind of reframing of human beings as sick, as a constellation of illnesses or of conditions. Um, and I mean, people's acquiescence in this is stunning. What explains that? I mean, one of the things I think about is one of the warmest memories of my childhood is, being in hospital and getting some presents, that you wouldn't usually get at that time of year, and feeling very cosseted, and no one's going to be cross at you, and so on. It's very, very warm sort of feeling. And I just think that is one of the explanations. People feel consoled and comforted by being able to just step away from the purposes of life and being taken care of. And unfortunately, we are drawn to that, especially perhaps when life itself has become also, demoralizing. So the attraction of stepping away from it becomes becomes stronger. But for whatever, and also I suppose the the embarking on a road of treatment and recovery and management of illness is a good replacement for lack of purpose, because it brings purpose with it. And one of the things that one sees now, which is very surprising, I suppose, is the eagerness with which many parents, for example, pursue diagnoses for their children. And again, it's one wonders whether it's a sort of compensation for what has been stripped away from the relationship between parents and children, which have been very much dismantled by state involvement, I think. And people are at a kind of loss. And all of a sudden, a medical trajectory or a quasi medical trajectory, diagnosis of, ADD or what, that this becomes a way of hanging, as something to hang the relationship on. And it's sad that it has the appeal that it does have, but I think it does. And what it does, lead to, as you suggested, is a whole potential for, you know, drug administration, um, which sorry, is on a kind of continuum with what I spoke about in terms of the application of professional strategies and the and of kind of abstract concepts to one's relationship with one's child, for example. The drug, appealing and applying drugs is a sort of extension of that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that explains, it's all on that sort of continuum where the relationship is made meaningful because of the very forceful purposefulness that is given to one by a kind of medical story, and then the solutions that are made available to one, whether they be pharmaceutical or, kind of strategizing, are also very consoling and give one a lot of business to be involved in a sense. Yes.
Just a small pivot, and I hope you don't mind. I was just wondering if you understand the economics behind it all. In the article, you offer a piece of statistics, and I've got it written down here. You basically say that in 2018, 1 in 100 British children was diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. In the US, that number was even higher. 1 in 59 American children on average was that year diagnosed with ASD. I think in California that number's even higher. It sits at something like 1 in 30 or something like that. I recall seeing a piece of statistics recently. So I'm just trying to really wrap my head around the perverse incentives and the economics of it all. Because ultimately, if you're really looking at the broader assessment, we have moved from a diagnosis of 1 in 30,000 to 1 in 30 in the last 30 years. And I'm not hearing a lot of conversation out there happening. So one thing that comes to my mind is that there has to be a perverse financial incentive embedded in the system. And I do appreciate that diagnostic tools have improved over the last few decades. That's fair enough. But something else must be going on there that we're not talking about. So, question to you, I suppose, just to simplifying it, it's like, do you have a understanding of the financial structure driving this whole thing?
I mean, no, in a way, but I mean, and by the way, those statistics are, out of date now, because the situation is becoming more and more intense so quickly. And actually, I know of a study that was conducted at the University of Montreal, which conducted a meta analysis of trends of diagnosis of autism. And it concluded, on a basis of that analysis, that if those trends continued, then by 2032, something like that, it would be statistically impossible to distinguish between those in the population who deserve or who merit a diagnosis of autism and those who don't. At which point everyone becomes as if autistic. Um, yeah, and if one of the effects of that is to provide a market for the range of drugs that are available for those with a diagnosis of autism, then one presumes that somebody or some set of people are becoming very, very wealthy on the back of this, as they are on the back of so many of kind of state sponsored medical interventions of populations, where the state provides a sort of massive marketplace, sometimes coerces it to assemble, and then allows the companies to profit from administering that and providing for that marketplace. But so, okay, people get very rich, but it seems to me that increasingly nowadays, what we need to look at, and what we ought not to be distracted by, is in fact this kind of profit motive, because it seems to me that in fact that is a sort of almost a kind of false flag. Oh, profit and capitalism, and then that somehow that's the enemy. And in a world of money printing and negative interest rates and hedging and massive funds, where loss and risk is basically built out of the equation. This is a milieu in which profit and capital and investment are no longer the main story. That's been taken care of. If you can print money and if you have negative interest rates, that's all gone then. So what's really at stake? What's really happening? Um, and I think it's control. It is control of people. That is now the main story, no longer money, in a sense. And if money is changing hands, then that is either a happy byproduct for those into whose hands it is falling, or in fact a kind of um, a distraction event from the real story, which is about control, which is occurring clearly through pharmaceutical intervention on a massive scale with populations, but also in terms of social interventions and cultural change and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, control is not really surprising here because there's such massive utility to knowing and having the right tools to control your population and bend it to the kind of needs of the machine. So that's evident even on its surface. I want to pay you an early compliment here because I think you have found a very original, out of the box angle when talking about autism. Through the article and even when I was reading your book, I thought this person has done a lot of deep, deep, meaningful thinking and found a very sort of original angle of attack. There is no question here. I just want to say that it's quite impressive because I've not come across a lot of work on this subject matter that's really
No.
structured like your work.
Well, I've thought actually quite a bit about this. I mean, I've become engaged by the problem of autism. And I'm going to call it a problem, by the way. It's one of the things that you're not supposed to do. It's supposed to be, like in many ways, okay, autism as a problem of society is a theme I'm interested in. But that, in a sense, is a kind of mainstream theme now, except not in the way that I would have it, because the claim is autism's not a problem. Autistic people are not a problem. The problem is the societies that's not inclusive enough of them. Now, this I disagree with. If we cannot begin from the point of saying that autism is a blight, it is a disability, it is a tragedy. I begin there, and I begin there from someone who lives with it, and not myself, but with my child who's 10 and who is autistic. And the the issue is that there are many very um, affecting and kind of forceful aspects about autism that I think make it quite special. And one of them is just the very subtle but kind of overwhelming manner in which it unfolds in a young child. And it's capable of, because the child is developing, and because you're so close to them, you miss the first 1,000 indicators, because development is uneven and all children are different and so on and so on. And so you're actually in the thick of it, and you're firefighting before you even have, at the moment that you have to acknowledge it. You're so the on ramp is not a gradual one. And one of the effects of that is you can hardly think straight, and you are now in a situation of extreme demand, in a way that is physical and psychological and emotional, just because that's what autism is. It is relentlessly energy sapping to try and support a child with it. And one of the effects of that is you hear so little from people whose children are autistic. Well, of course you don't, because they're exhausted, and their thought processes are utterly scrambled, and they cannot finish sentences, and they will be like that for years. So one of the things that I did, you see, I'm becoming impassioned now, and in a way, it's an attempt to finish my sentences, because you do become scrambled. And so one of the things I tried to resolve to do was to produce something, to write a book on autism, you know, because it's almost impossible to do it. And it has taken me a long time now. The COVID thing, of course, I mean, was, yeah, interrupted it in a way that was unpredictable, but it still took a long time, because it took a long time to write paragraphs. And I felt that there is a value in doing this because the conditions militate against it. um, so so I begin with autism is a problem for the people who have it, and I say who really have it. And one of the things that needs to be pushed back against is this um, notion of the spectrum, which is effective because there is, of course, a truth in it. um, Autistic children, like children generally, are different from one another, and and the way in which the condition affects them can be different. And so there is a kind of spectrum, but that has been amplified beyond, beyond fact and beyond reality. And I meet some children with autism, and the idea, for example, that they had to fight for their diagnosis. Fight for their diagnosis. You should see them at 3 from a distance of 200 yards. They're autistic. There is no fight. So it's that cohort that I'm interested in. I think children today have all kinds of challenges and problems. I think many of them are beginning to exhibit autistic like symptoms. And this is a phenomenon I'm interested in. But I'm also interested in isolating the growing numbers of really autistic children whose tragedy is hidden by talk of inclusion, and whose actual existence is hidden by the sort of general rollout of of the condition. So, it's a complicated thing. But also then, so okay, I accept that it is a condition of individuals. I think it's a shocking thing to be on the increase in children. I think this level of outrage is missed because people are persuaded that it's a kind of general phenomenon that we must be just a more understanding of. And I also think it must be linked to environmental factors, to toxins introduced in whatever way. I am ashamed of how little I know about that. And in part, it's because, again, the onset of autism in your child and is so distressing and disturbing and demanding. It's a number of years later that you get to step back and think, why? Why did that happen? And by that time, I don't know, there seem to be other things to think about and so on. So I know that there is a body of literature out there. There are campaigners out there who link autism with, for example, the MMR vaccine. I'm open to any of that because I think there must be something, but I know little of it. But I also think that it doesn't, that, that line of inquiry, which is hugely important, does not, it can sit alongside my line of inquiry, which is that autistic children are very, very significant now because the ways in which they are dysfunctional actually reveal a lot of what is dysfunctional about our society, the society in which they are abroad. And they do that uh, via their distress and their kind of antisocial behavior and their lack of understanding. They show you all the ways in which our institutions and our society are, um, well, less than they should be is the wrong way to put it. Are flawed from at the very core. So yeah, I mean, that's the, I suppose, point at which I think you can have a parallel lines of inquiry. One which regards autism as a blight that is surely caused by some environmental factors, but the other that regards autism as an opportunity to show us how it is our society and the institutions that it relies upon are deeply flawed.
This is a very interesting point of view that you've just offered us, and a corrective to kind of how I've been thinking about this. Because looking at the statistics, if you kind of go back to early 1990s, you can see things starting to spike disproportionately compared to all the previous years. So one has to start wondering, if the prevalence is growing every single year, it's just, it's spiking higher and higher and higher. Where's the outrage? Where are the parents? Where's the activism? Who's lobbying the government? Who's trying to get to the bottom of it? And at your level, when you have to deal with this day to day, it's so interesting just to hear that you want people just to back off and not expect that specifically, because having an autistic child is emotionally taxing, is demanding, is physically draining. So you just want people to back off and leave you be. And I really appreciate that transparency, because it kind of like opens my mind a little bit to the realities of it all.
I mean, that's absolutely true, and I think that's overlooked. That it's autism is a very interesting condition. I think it's pivotal now, and this is indicated by the amount of emphasis that's placed upon it. I think it's very useful for the powers that be in terms of their plans for rearrangement of the population and reframing of social life and um, kind of self-reflection and engagement with the world and so on. But it's also very useful because the people who might wish to shed light on it are for the most part just exhausted and dispirited in a way that is really very profound. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think uh, I mean, also, of course, they're affected by what I spoke about earlier, which is there it does certainly give a meaning. I mean, it just changes your whole life. And so if your life had been one where it suffered from lack of meaning, which of course many people's lives do now, then, well, here's a meaning for you. Here's a lifelong project, that will occupy your every thought. So it also has that, I think, which people appreciate in a sort of way. And it also, of course, comes with a lot of interaction with state institutions, management perhaps of drugs, and implementation of strategies, all the sublimation activities, I suppose, that are available to people whose lives are being made increasingly anemic by contemporary conditions. So you have that too. Um,
According to what you have written, apparently in Ireland, the state's position on autism is that it is a talent or a blessing of some kind. So, first of all, is that really true? And if it is, how do we square that circle?
well, I mean, so it's interesting. I mean, I think Ireland's an interesting case, in the same way that autism is an interesting condition. But I refer in the article to a piece that was published in the Irish Times, where they had done a survey of the Irish people and had asked them about autism and their understanding of it. And the article in the Irish Times castigated the Irish public because I think 7 or 8 out of 10 of them associated autism with negative characteristics. And the negative characteristics were, can't don't make eye contact, can't really interact with people very well, i.e., autism, right? That's exactly what autism is. What do you think it is? I mean, so it was extraordinary because the Irish Times was effectively presenting the Irish population as requiring re education so that they would be able to appreciate that autism is, in fact, well, what a whole constellation of possibilities, that are simply not being tapped into by a society in which interaction is demanded of people and understanding of the world. It's complete madness. So again, it just, I suppose, was an opportunity for me to reiterate the point that unless we can begin from the statement that autism is um, a disability, a profound one and a lifelong one, where are we going? And I mean, you wouldn't be surprised probably, but that perspective, which I express at any chance I have, because and again, I feel I can because I have an autistic child. If you don't, then you can't say those things now. So, I think there is a responsibility as well on those who have this opportunity to say that. And I say it at every chance I get. And there's almost always a push. Oh, no. Oh, don't say that. Well, what would I say? I mean, I have a friend who's blind. What am I supposed to say? Blindness is an opportunity? She wouldn't say that. So, of course, it comes with interesting experiences. And it also develops in people very extraordinary aptitudes, of course. But taken all in all, it's a disaster. And so is autism. But I mean, so the mention of Ireland, I suppose, had to do with both the Dublin mayor saying that, or planning Dublin to be an autism-friendly city, and also that Irish Times article, which was quite extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, Ireland has made itself available for these kinds of globalist uh, strategies, which come down centrally and are administered by the likes of Dublin's Lord Mayor. And Ireland has made itself available for those in a way that's really well, extraordinary. And one of the interesting things about Ireland is when I grew up, Ireland was still a very traditional society. Um, and the leap it has taken into everything that is post traditional is stunning. And in many ways, it's the traditional ties that have facilitated that. So I know um, many of, we'll say, my parents' generation who would have been raised, as I was, in a very strict Catholic way and who still cleave to a lot of those values. But who have very strong family ties, and it's one of the great things about Ireland is the intergenerational um, um, interaction, and so they're persuaded by their children very easily actually to vote, for example. Ireland was, I think, the first country in the world to in some way enshrine gay marriage in a way that's protected, perhaps constitutionally, I can't remember, but there was a referendum, and I know many of my parents' generation who voted for that, like a thing that would have been inconceivable to them, but they do it on the back of faith in their children, you see. So it's quite interesting how a traditional aspect of Irish society has actually accelerated it into a post-traditional mode. Um, I mean, I, the other aspect, of course, is that Ireland has, perhaps through its post-colonial, I mean, John Waters, a very interesting commentator in Ireland on Ireland, has said that a lot about Ireland can be explained by the impulse to prove that you're not a savage, and that this is a feature of a post-colonial situation where you're all the time, trying to present yourself as not the natives, and that this has in fact led Ireland to leap into every which way they can prove that we're not savages over here. So maybe that also explains aspects of it, that Ireland is in a rush to be inclusive, diverse, equal, and all of those buzzwords that we hear about.
I think that interesting pattern has really permeated the entire West, particularly the Anglo world. You Australia and New Zealand and Canada, Great Britain, USA to some extent. Funny thing is that Ireland's never been a colonial power. I don't think you guys have conquered any countries or were attempting to build an empire. But anyway, stable cohort of familiar people, food that comes from the soil, learning from routine. These are the three things you've listed as basic foundations of support and care when it comes to autistic children. How are the state programs of support and institutions aligning, or maybe not aligning, to these principles on your side of the fence?
Yeah, I mean, this is really addresses the core of the way in which I try to present autism as an opportunity, because for all that the existence of autism in our children is horrific, it also the ways in which we can be that are beneficial to children with autism are in fact ways that um, we would all benefit from, that children in particular all need, and that show up the failings of the institutions to which we usually appeal when we're looking for health and care and education and so on. And I mean, one of the real kind of core problems um, with our appeal to institutions and to professions for support and assistance, for example, with our disabled children, is that, and this is a point that comes straight from Foucault's account of institutions, the prison and the hospital, and so on, is that at the very inception of these institutions was the impulse to reform. There was no prison without the impulse to reform the prison. So, and how this translates into contemporary times is the requirement always to be tweaking, to implement strategies, but as you implement them, to be assessing them and to be planning their alteration and improvement. The For example, the school, the primary school, which I have involvement with my son, who goes there very little, in fact, which is good. Um, the the meetings, the reviews, and so on, which we engage in endlessly, are all about restating for forms and for appreciation by assessment umbrella institutions which award schools of outstanding or not outstanding or whatever. So you need to input into these forms all the new ideas, the new ways you're going to approach this child. Now, the problem is that if you have any chance of helping a child with autism, a few strategies are important, but just a very few. And then you need to implement them for 3 years. 7 years, 10 years. It's the relentlessness that is important. And that is the very thing that these institutions, from their very outset, could not do. And certainly now have no chance of doing. They do not even know what they are until they are reviewing and reforming their strategies. So, by definition, the child with autism can only be made infinitely worse in their situation if they are being helped by these institutions. So, but the thing is that while many normal children, and I have a normal child, which I'm very glad about for many reasons, but one reason is that so many times people wish to say, oh, but, normal children too, or they don't use the word normal, but I do. Normal, abnormal, that'll do. So I know about that too, and I know about how these institutions are very, very challenging and counterproductive, and so on. But a normal child will pass muster, will muddle through. But they will muddle through in a way that is very onerous, because children require stability, they require routine, they require relentlessness in their upbringing from whoever it is they're interacting with. The fact that autistic children actually melt down without it is a helpful event or a helpful situation, because it shows us how counterproductive these institutions are. And I mean, so that's, I suppose, educational strategies. Then other things that children with autism require. I mean, another thing they require is physical interaction. you know so autism is a situation, is a condition in which anything that is communicated through language is a problem. And it's only when you have an autistic child that you realize how much our society attempts to communicate, how much is done through language. Even music, for example, in school, the children are sitting down and they're listening to words. PE classes where when it's raining, they're sitting down and they're listening to words. Everything is translated into words, so much language. And children with autism, some are non-verbal, but my son is not non-verbal, but he still cannot understand language and interaction that is primarily linguistic. If you say to him, "What's your name?" he can't answer it. He knows his name is Joseph, but he can't answer it. So the lack of availability for linguistic interaction is profound. So that the exclusion that is the result of a society in which so much is translated into abstract language, well, it's really extreme. So the requirement for physical, if you want to teach a child with autism something, the best way to do it is to put your hand over their hand. Don't talk, and do it, or move them, or it's physical. That is what teaches them, that is what addresses them, that is the best mode of communication and of interaction and of education. So you can just imagine again the COVID scenario where everything became remote. Well, now you have a situation of total exclusion of anyone with autism. But that's just an extreme, and showed us really what the conditions of our society already were. A society in which education, care, and support were even potentially um, simulatable remotely already shows how much had been translated into a non-physical remote mode. Um, so that's another opportunity, I suppose, that autism offers for us to see what we have lost in terms of our physical interaction. And even language use can be physical. So for example, my son is very good at learning off poetry. I've just started this with him, actually. And when we were growing up, we still had the phrase to learn something by heart, you know And now, of course, that nowadays that's out because you don't understand it if you've learned it by heart. It's all supposed to be about understanding, which is really the ability to trade kind of linguistic concepts in a very self-reflective mode. But if you learn something by heart, it's in you. You have the feel of those words. You can be staring at the window abstractly and still be saying them because they're, and now that way of interacting with language is available, I think, to people with autism. It's a kind of lived and bodied linguistic mode. And my son's very like Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman. That's what he's like. And Dustin Hoffman was like that in that film. He would talk and talk the Abbott and Costello sketch, Who's on First. And he would say it over and over again when he was driving, and because that was how language was for him, an embodied mode. So that again is another area of life which is really foregrounded by those with autism. Um, all kinds of meaningful modes, I think, ways of experiencing ourselves and others and the world in a way that is embodied, physical, involved, all these ways which are receding from us or have receded from us now. And I look at children, I spend a lot of time in the school that Joseph attends very, very infrequently, and I look at the children there and I see increased fractiousness, attention deficit everywhere, um, bewilderment, really, masquerading, of course, as sort of childhood frolics, because that's how adults around them interpret it, which is wrong. This is not childhood frolics. These are screams for help because these children are bewildered and fractious, and um, they cannot attend, they cannot engage, and the reason is they're not being given the opportunities to. So the tragedy is for more than those with autism. It's a general tragedy, I think.
Let us pivot away from the Brownstone article to your upcoming book titled Autistic Society Disorder. Do you think this will be its final published title, or is this something that you're still thinking about?
Well, I would say it'll be the final. I mean, this book, it seems to me to have taken just my lifetime to write. And everything that's happened in between, personally, but also, of course, globally, just seems to have made the time seem so much longer. I don't know. So everything about it, for good or ill, is now final, I believe. Um, and also, I mean, I intend to publish it myself, which I've never done. I've published numbers of books, um, but the more recent ones have been published by what would be, I think, self-identifying as radical left publishers. And I do believe that the radical left has been shown up in recent years to be not so radical, and in fact to be quite firmly embedded in the establishment. And for that reason, and because I suppose I made, I won't say a name, but I made something more public of myself during COVID times with the publication of articles in a fairly constant way. Anyhow, that radical cohort wouldn't touch me with a barge pole, I would say now. So I am going forth and publishing this myself, and which does not play to my strengths because it's very hard to do this if you're not technically gifted or even competent. So, but I have now turned my attention to things like bleed margins, and am therefore not available for any further intellectual alteration of the manuscript.
Well, I do feel for you because designing a good quality book cover is it's not an easy thing. Going back to the manuscript that you've shared, I thought your book is full of fascinating, and I'd have to say, quite original observations about autism and the nature of our modern society. I mean, you partially have answered this question already, but specifically with regards to the book, can you tell us what was the main reason behind you writing it?
I mean, I suppose just the initially the experience of beginning to um, seek assistance, in trying to um, care for Joseph, trying to help him, because well, you haven't a clue, you just don't know what it is and how it's going to go. And one of the, I think, undermining aspects of autism in your child is that it really is unknown. I mean, there's so much that's predictable about it, and yet you just don't know how this is going to go, and what he's going to be like at 7 and at 10. So you feel very much at a loss, and the initial phase is of just trying to avail yourself of any kind of support you can get, any advice you can get, and so like you do, and some of it is very helpful. But increasingly, as you gain confidence, you begin to notice that um, some of the advice is bizarre and counterproductive, and um, and so you begin to lose faith, I suppose, in the kind of institutional interventions, and also, I suppose, out in the world, it begins to be very obvious to you how language bound our interactions are. Um, all of the reasons why it's difficult to be in the world with your child, begin to kind of be made salient in a very often very painful way. Um, so I suppose it just is just I mean, my philosophical background, it originally was in hermeneutics, and I wrote my PhD on a philosopher called Hans Georg Gadamer. Um, and a central theme in Gadamer's work is the problem of interpretation. I mean, the problem of understanding. Um, and for him, there is something very potentially kind of productive and enlightening about finding a way to step back to, I suppose, defamiliarize the familiar, because it allows you to identify, at least in part, some of the kind of shaping, the background assumptions and kind of tacit principles and so on that operate upon one. And I think having a child with autism gives you that opportunity, because the world suddenly seems very different, and you're different, and or and you can no longer coast along. So, being somebody with a background in philosophy and somebody who had tried to write philosophical analyses of the university, of the art world, um, I my natural impulse was to use this situation, and to use the kind of productive aspects of it, and write about how it caused me to see the world and our society, is what I mean, the society we live in, to see it for what it is, or more for what it is, than I had been able to do.
There is a chapter in your book where you mention that the behavior of an autistic child, such as covering her ears and spinning in a supermarket, reflects a profound honesty about the world. Can you elaborate for us on why do you believe autistic children serve as the truest mirror to our society, and also what insights
Yeah.
can we gain from their behavior about societal norms and
Yeah.
expectations?
I mean, yeah, I suppose it's a truism to observe of our environment now. Um, how very aggravating it is, and how very changeful and precarious, and how it demands of us a set of skills that are very surface, very shallow, but require to be on, because um, we meet people in such a passing way, and we're moving between places, and we're interacting with service providers, and with customer service people, and it's just everything is quite fleeting. And I mean, there's an Italian philosopher whose name is Paolo Verno, and he speaks about the virtuosity that is really the mode which is required for thriving in the kind of metropolitan environments that we um, increasingly find ourselves in, um, which mean that you must be prepared to be on the fly, and many of the interactions are kind of low level and formulaic, but you had better be prepared to shift in and out of them and to, go through the motions of them and so on. So it's a kind of a shallow virtuosity is what's required. And part of the virtuosity is being able to perform in that way in an environment which is quite, aggravating of one's kind of sensory experience, so lights and noise, or sort of grim environments, very inhuman blocks of concrete, and traffic and fumes, and also input by technology, beepings of phones and phone calls and headphone. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you stand back from it. Now, if you have a child with autism, you can make a blanket statement: none of that is good. It's all a disaster. The virtuosity, the constant changing, the sensory input, everything. And what works is the opposite of all of that. One of the people that I meet sometimes, who's very good on autism, from the city council here at Newcastle, he says that when he works with children who are teenagers, who have autism, and if they're able to answer the question, which is a caveat that needs to be made, if he says to them, what would you most like? Their answer overwhelmingly is to be left alone. Now, autism is, of course, a condition that almost screams that, right? You're best on your own. But actually, autistic children often quite enjoy company and people, but it's more of an alongsideness. So they would like to be alongside a lot of life, doing their thing. And the problem now is that that is regarded as this, as dysfunctional and unhappy, and lonely, and all of that, because we live in a society in which constant low level virtuosic involvement is the definition of what's normal. So I think just by pushing back against that, as autistic children do, who are spinning around and flapping in the supermarket, just because a lot of that is just a way of building out that noise. If you flap your hands, you create a kind of atmosphere around yourself, or you spin around, you block it out. I mean, this is what autism is drawn towards doing. And if people ask questions, and it's kind, of course, but these questions are, oh, are you excited by school? I mean, my son can't understand any question like that. But even if it was a question he could understand, his impulse is to get rid of it, stop the language. And he's learned to answer yes to every question. So he constantly misinforms people, but his yes is just a yes of go away, because he's trying to cope. And I think where you find autistic children happiest is in calmer environments. Outdoors is often said, oh, autistic people like outdoors. Well, it's mostly because all outdoors tends to be, a park, just calmer. So yeah, I mean, I think the conditions that are suited to autistic children reveal the very onerous conditions under which the rest of us are um, forced to operate. And we do so more or less well, but actually, I think we don't do so very well. And the rise in medications for anxiety and depression, and other kind of lifestyle related
Mm.
conditions, I think shows that we do not do well in this mode.
In your book, you discuss the perceived division between our innate understanding of health and the influence of the medical establishment and its massive industrial complex.
Mm,
Could you delve deeper into how you see this division impacting our ability to connect with and manage our own health, and what steps can be taken to really
mm.
bridge this gap?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the kind of defining move has been to obliterate health in favor of illness. I mean, we think of ourselves as having a health service, but we really have an illness service, because unless you're ill, there's no way of interacting with it. Now, even when you when one says that nowadays, it's one feels one has communicated very little, because health has fallen so far beyond the pale of our aptitudes. We hardly know what it is, what anyone's talking about when they're talking about, no, not illness, health. And I think about I like to read kind of the novels of Jane Austen, for example. And it's interesting to read those novels because they unwittingly expose an entirely other kind of milieu. And one of the things that's quite striking in those novels is the extent to which people attend to the minutiae of their everyday bodily experience, their expulsions and their slight kind of headaches and their responses to drafts and to a change in the wind, direction and all of this. It's like it shows up a kind of common and shared level of competence that we have entirely lost. Who nowadays knows anything about what a change in wind direction might do to their bodied experience? We know nothing of these things. So we have forsaken experience of our own health for attachment to categories of illness and management of illness. And I mean, the philosopher I spoke of, Hans Georg Gadamer, he lived to 100. And actually, he produced very, very interesting material in his 80s and 90s. And including, he did interviews, radio interviews. And this actually consoles me because I'm not near 90. And I'm thinking that by 90, I might have developed some kind of ability to, communicate well in these kinds of channels, as he did. So he gave numbers of radio interviews on the topic of health, and they're collected, at least in one collection called the Enigma of Health. So it's a collection of um, interviews and short essays that he wrote, and they're very, because they were interviews, they're kind of public intellectual mode, and they're really excellent and prescient. And these were produced in the 80s and 90s in the last century. So, but what I mean, the title of the collection is "The Enigma of Health," and that's his point: is that in a world in which all we can understand are illnesses, in which the only way in which we can experience our own embodiment is via illness or conditions, what has become utterly escapable is health. um, we don't have words for it. And Illich is interesting because he, in that book, The Limits to Medicine, he includes, a very partial but very long list of words which different societies used to use in replacement for our word pain. Um, and all those nuances of attendance to modes of embodiment have fallen away, and we're left with this uh, block category pain, which we extend to psychological experiences, emotional experiences, grief. They're all called pain, and you can go down and buy some paracetamol for that, or something stronger. So it has a single knee-jerk pharmaceutical response. So the kind of dreadful streamlining of our experience of our own embodiment has been one of the very dispiriting um, features of our time, and has really been a big factor, I think, in the kind of management of people. And it has worked via the estrangement of us from an experience of our own bodily modes, which would seem to be, well, impossible. But of course, it's far from impossible. We are available. And again, that's a very Foucauldian point. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault presents us with that modern mode where you take bodies and you do things with them. You don't have to address minds. You don't have to persuade people of anything. You just take their bodies and move them and discipline them. And all of a sudden, you have a level of docility in an entire population which you could have never have achieved by preaching at people from the pulpit.
That is so interesting. I mean, you are reading my mind here, as the next question I had lined up for you references the chapter about pain
Oh, yes.
and our addiction to pain numbing drugs. You know, by no means I'm bragging here, but my last visit to my dentist, I explicitly asked for no local anesthesia, as I didn't really mind a bit of pain and the dentist didn't really care. Well, apart from asking me, "Are you sure?" twice. But when I relayed that story to somebody at work, they could not believe it. They thought I was insane. It was an insane thing to do, not to take something that's there for taking and get rid of that sensation of pain altogether. In our modern society, pain seems to be the ultimate
Yeah.
enemy.
No, I understand why. My God. I mean, but see, one of the ways in which we have been managed is through a sort of propaganda campaign against pain, right? So you go to your dentist and you're totally prone, and she suggests that you get a pain, injection. And in that moment, who are you to say? I mean, so you don't know the pain. As you said, it's very interesting that you went through it, because the number of people who we now have left who will come back from having had the experience and tell us about it is waning, and yeah, so so we don't even allow ourselves to experience it. So far removed have we. Not only can do we not have words to describe it, as Illich points out, but we don't even experience it anymore. um yeah, I mean, it's in that collection of health essays, uh, Gadamer produced a very interesting account of the experience of death, which I think we could transfer to pain as well. Where kind of describes all the ways in our society in which the experience of death has receded, as a public ritual with funerals going through the streets, as a private experience with dead people or dying people in beds at home, and of course as a personal experience, because, well, I suppose most people are on morphine and midazolam to make sure that it happens quickly. But, in that sense, these experiences, which we might say are actually constitutive of the kind of shaping margins of what it is to be human, have been um, very gently taken from us. And as you say of your friends, if you point that out, for example, of the experience of death or of pain, the questions are, well, why would we want that? Well, what have you lost by not having it available?
Well, transhumanism is a thing, and it seems to be coming for all of us, whether we like it or
I
not.
agree.
There's an interesting passage in your book that talks about you going into some kind of a consultation session at your son's school, and I think you being coached by the teachers or
Oh,
some
yeah.
state bureaucrats on how to make this announcement to your child. And I know this is super nuanced. And then again, this bit made me kind of sad because I was sort of wondering what would that piece of information really do to a child that has this condition? Like, is it even relevant to try and figure out how to tell the child that he has autism? Like, what's your point of view?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it's an utterly inconceivable conversation because, you know, I, um, I, I think there is something that autistic children, and as far as I can tell, this will be true, simply cannot uh, wield their own diagnosis. That's it. What autism means is you can't do that. I mean, Joseph is so far from being able to identify anything about himself, whether he's hungry, whether he's tired. He can't conceive of these things. So this idea, the very idea that sometime I'll be telling him now, you know that you're autistic, it's so far. It's I'm not sure it will ever happen. So there's a sense in which it's a kind of a false preparation, and one wonders whether it's raised as an issue because of the application of the term autism to many children who aren't really autistic. I wonder whether, in fact, we ought to say that if you can engage with yourself as an autistic person, then you're not autistic. If you're capable of that level of self reflection, understanding of your situation in the world, and well, then you're not autistic. I wonder. I mean, I'm that's kind of where I'm at with it because and at 7 years old, would I have known that? I don't know, but it's amazing how these things become salient. And while progression occurs, and Joseph learns, for example, he doesn't progress at all in that direction. So I'm not sure it's a problem I'm ever going to have to face. But I suppose, in a way, the real change, the game changer, is when, as a parent, you're given that label for your child. And that for me was an incredibly just depressing moment. Not depressing because, I mean, I already could see all kinds of things about Joseph, but it was so alienating. You get that label, and all of a sudden, you begin to interact with your child as an autistic person. And it's quite stunning how distancing that is. So you begin to implicitly appeal to strategies that one would apply to an autistic person. Well, that's a very anonymous mode with which to engage with your 3.5-year-old child. So uh, it's it's um, it's describing an alternative universe now to suggest that what would be better is if one were simply left alone with one's child who has all kinds of characteristics. In the world we live in, it's useful to have the designator autism. It's a useful way of collecting together a whole bunch of children who are suffering. It's also useful in the world because it's in the world with a child with autism is not always easy, and it can help to have a summary for people. um, but overall, the distancing effect of these labels is quite profound, and the extent to which it leaves one vulnerable to having to appeal then to the strategies that come with the labels and the expectations that come with the labels and the new set of landmarks, etc., etc. So you're immediately vulnerable to all of that interference.
Okay, let's pivot a little bit. In your book, you discuss the phenomenon of so called childification, where children are treated in ways that emphasize their childlike qualities, potentially limiting the exposure to experiences that foster maturity and independence. Would you be able to elaborate for us on how this trend affects the development of children and their perception of the world around them?
Yeah.
Additionally, I'm sorry, this is a double barreled question. Additionally, what do you see as the consequences of denying children opportunities to engage with more adult like experiences? And how can society like ours
Yeah.
strike a better balance between nurturing innocence and fostering growth?
I suppose the innocence of children is a function of their position with respect to fully established adult human life. It is in contrast to that children are salient as innocent, because they are. They don't know all the things that we know or presume, and so their perspective on us is refreshing, and that is the charm of innocence, because they're not laden with our presuppositions and our expectations, and yet they, looking in at that world, are often fascinated by it, enlivened in a way that perhaps foregrounds the extent to which we've become jaded. So I think the innocence of childhood is a function of the position of children as a sort of, well, alongside or a sidecar of adult human life. And their, halting attempts to begin to come into that and to be brought into that. Now, the problem now is that we have taken that innocence and attempted to, secure it, protect it, um, kind of dress it, give it childlike, innocent lines to say, innocent activities to engage in. Then you lose the innocence, because the innocence was a function of alongsideness with the adult world. Um, so if you look at old even pictures of my father as a young boy, are photographs of him in a suit. Now, not a tie, but a suit jacket and a shirt, short trousers. That was the only difference between him, peaked cap, and the men. And it looks cute, and it looks, yeah, and that is it is a sartorial expression of the position of children in those times with respect to the kind of adult world. So the I think innocence has been lost, in fact, by the uh, determination, and the strategies that have been put in place to provide innocence and childhood with its own spaces and zones and activities and so on, and then to protect it so assiduously that, to make it so safe that, in fact, the world is placed at a further and further remove. And one of the things that children are therefore robbed of is the opportunity to learn from the adult world, that vital kind of apprenticeship that had been natural, naturally provided to children. Um, and so they're left with with a sort of a tube fed content of materials, too geared for children, too specific to innocence, and in that sense too cynical, not innocent, too knowing. This is the child's space, this is the innocence space. When it becomes knowing, it's no longer innocent. So I think this is a very, well, one doesn't hear this spoken of, the cynicism of childhood, with all its paraphernalia. This would be, I know, reacted against very strongly by most people. For who, and
Doesn't matter.
well, I know that doesn't matter, but I feel, I suppose, constrained to say it. And one of the things, I mean, that group of French thinkers who wrote that raw materials for a theory of the young girl, they've also produced other books under the title, the authorship title, The Invisible Committee. And one of those, which are very good, those books, one of them is called the Coming Insurrection, and there are others. And they speak about the seriousness of childhood, that is what has been taken away. So children are now to be gambling and shouting and, amongst themselves. But of course, there ought to be a great seriousness to childhood. Here are, future adults. Here are, with the greatest capacity to learn, with an incredible openness, which ought to be, if it wasn't fed by such conventional content, um, and with energy, and vitality, which is the great promise and ought to be of childhood. And again, which is waning, because overexposure to screens and not enough sleep and not good food has actually robbed children of their vitality in a very serious way.
My take on this is that most children thrive when they are given an opportunity to grapple with something challenging. Not always, but often enough for it to form a pattern. You want to go on a road trip? Well, here's a map. Tell me how
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
going to
yeah,
get to the
yeah.
beach. Tell me how we're going to get to Newcastle. Go ahead and navigate.
And actually, I mean, you tap into an area of learning that autistic children can be very good at. And one of the tragedies for children with autism is that there's the skills and aptitudes that they tend to have are now utterly useless. So, if I'm driving along the road anywhere in England and I'm not indicating early enough for where we're going to go, Joseph at the back seat, oh, 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 because he knows And because he looks at I don't teach him these things, but he looks at maps, and I give him books, and he knows all of this. But of course, now we have sat nav, so nothing could be more useless, you know. And he's good at mental arithmetic, but who even hears about mental arithmetic anymore, you know? So these kinds of old forms of learning, and because we've become means end oriented in our um, conception of what it is to be educated and so on, we've lost the idea that actually to do mental arithmetic is good for your mind, and it is good for your feel for anything to do with numeracy, you know, and the world insofar as it requires numeracy. All of that's very important. And maps the same, orientation. um, I don't have a sat nav, and I drive around Newcastle trying to find football matches, you know, for young children. It's my main activity in life. And I stopped a while ago at a street because unhelpfully streets don't put their names on anymore. And I stopped at a street and I said to a young woman sitting outside her house, and I said, "Is this, you know, Albemarle? I don't know what name." "I don't know," she said. "Do you not know where you live?" Now, maybe she didn't live there, but she had all the look of living there. And I truly believe she did not know the name of her street. So, this is how unworlded we have become.
There's another interesting part of your book where you delve into the dynamics of care within care homes, particularly the roles
Oh,
of
yeah.
women who trade duties of care within their own families for duties of care within institutional settings. You describe this cycle where women care for other families in care homes while their own families may receive care from other strangers. Could you elaborate on the societal forces that perpetuate this cycle of care and the implication it has for both the caregivers and those receiving care? And additionally, and again, I'm asking you two questions for the price of one. Additionally, how might we address the systemic inequalities and challenges faced by caregivers, particularly in the context of providing care for vulnerable populations such as individuals with autism?
You know, I suppose of all of all human achievements, the achievement of care is has been most cheapened, um, and most under attack, um, in our society. And it it has been so aggressively undermined that to be a carer now is almost inevitably to be somebody who does not care about the person or people that they are a carer for. Because you know, in these, once care has been institutionalized, then the fundamental ingredient of care, which is fundamentally personal, is removed, and everyone is now playing a role, or, you know, and the ideal is that that role is filled by any person. So the role of, you know, nursery nurse, or of, you know, carer in a care home, and, you know, you can have your days off, and or you can leave. And of course they're utterly precarious, these jobs, because they're so, and that, I mean, in a sense feeds into the second part of your question. They're, you know, the precarity is built in because they're so poorly paid. And you know, they recruit from kind of classes, you know, whose own lives are often more precariously balanced, and all of that. So you have the one thing that these institutions, these early years institutions, and the one thing that they fight against actively is the creep to the personal, which actually inevitably happens even when the atmosphere for it is as thin as possible. So you have little 6-month olds, you know, and even though they hardly have met their um, nursery worker, you know, they will form a little attachment. But no, she's moved on. Now have this one, and it doesn't matter because it's the role that matters. But the problem is the role is not what can care. The role is an inhuman um, construct. So Yes, I think that of all things, care is what has suffered. Um, and you will find with any, marginal group, early years, uh, you know, ailing, aged, disabled people, that's the very thing they require, the personal element. And, you know, I have spent my time with Joseph attending school, and that if I was to summarize the battle, it is the battle for the personal, to retain some personal relationships with an institution which regards that as regressive. So it is a very explicit battle, and which despises it, by the way, has contempt for it, because the personal and the professional have been set against each other. So if, as an early years worker, you are valued for your personal relationship, somehow that is deprofessionalizing your role. And people, even the lowest paid, are encouraged to regard themselves on a career path, a professional career path. And all of that is intended to produce the effect that any personal um, uh, claim on you is like ballast on your professional path. So it's that fundamental, the kind of tension at the heart of care. I mean, one of the institutions that is appealed to with nostalgia now, and which, because it is certainly under attack, is the institution of the family and the nuclear family. But a point that I try to articulate in the book is that actually the nuclear family was already a problem, and it already incarcerated the achievement of care in a way that was anathema to it. Illich, to um, refer explicitly now to Illich, his claim is that the subject of history for all of human time, pre-modern, the modern era, was the kinship group, not the nuclear family. And actually, what we now appeal to as a sort of long lost past, the woman in the home and the man out to work and so on, which I would say for the most part certainly worked better than the outsourcing of all of that to the state. But that was already a deformation of the more natural mode whereby care circulated within a kinship group and not a nuclear family. And I think all the struggles of women to uphold their role in the nuclear family were a function of that abandonment of the more natural formation, which is a broader and more fluid one. And I have some family who are from India, and they would say, when they go to India, you get off the plane and go to the family home, and you lose your children. You don't actually see them hardly for 2 weeks because they're around, and no one's because they're and decisions are being taken, which you kind of have to accept, because they just take them on, and that's a more of a kinship group mode. And it relieves the mother who had too much weight put upon her in the nuclear family and was too isolated. So already, I mean, I speak in the book and in the chapter on care about the containment of care. That has been a very deliberate trajectory in the modern era, and but the early containment of care involved the reorganization of the population into nuclear families, I think.
I know we are now getting to a 2 hour mark, but I have two more quick questions for you, I promise. Can we talk a little bit about the theory of mind and its applicability to the subject matter we are discussing here? Maybe you can explain it by going back to the Baron Cohen experiment, which you
Mm,
reference in your book.
yeah, Yeah, so this arises in the chapter on the self, which I think closes the book. And um, yeah, I I suppose take on what is a or was a very influential account of autism, um, based on an experiment by Simon Baron Cohen at Cambridge in the 90s, I think. Um, and the conclusion of the experiment was that autistic children are defined by their not having a theory of other minds. Um, so that they don't they're not able to leap into the perspective of other people, and um, and therefore are blocked really from understanding other people because they have no idea what their motivations are, their expectations are, etc. Now, this is completely true. This is absolutely true of, I mean, for example, my son will be in another room and say, be looking at a book. Oh, look, here it is. Or he'll say, in other words, saying things as if I can see it. Well, I'm not even in the room, or he'll hold a book like this and say, like he'll have a way of indicating that he wants me to tell me what the word is. Well, I can't see the book. He doesn't even know that he needs to turn it around so I can see it. So there's that level of blockage against being able to be in the mind of others or in the perspective of them. But I suppose what I try to do in that chapter is to show up how constricting and how rigid our interactions have become by virtue of an overemphasis on the achievement of theory of mind, so that we're now encouraged to be so attuned to what the theoretical framework of other people's experience is, that other people have become for us primarily theoretical constructs. And so we understand them in terms of their, economic demographic, their age, their perhaps their medical conditions, their neurological space that they operate in. So we've become available for all of these very abstract modes of understanding and interacting with others. Um, and so, what I try to do in that chapter is to, I suppose, be a champion for modes of interaction that are not primarily theoretical and do not require a theory of mind. And autistic children can be quite good at showing us the joys and fulsomeness of those modes of interaction. And again, those modes are often very, what we would think of as intuitive and bodied. Um, so I use the example, of when we see a toddler. This is a terrible theme, get a prick of a needle. I mean, nothing could be worse nowadays, right? But the way we would go like this, and it's not because it's because you're sort of feeling it with them, and it affects you like that. Or if you see people who are laughing in a very fulsome way, sometimes it makes you laugh. You don't know what they're laughing at. You have absolutely no theory about this, but it's infectious. And that is the mode by which I think autistic people naturally interact with others. It's to do with um, shared bodied experience. It's to do with response to facial expression. So when, Joseph says to me, he goes like this, because I've got two frown lines, and he points them out. And it's him saying, these are here, and there's a feeling of things are not good, and these should not be here. None of this is a theory of my mind. He's not shackled by a sense that mum's cross, or but he has a very kind of bodily reaction to it. It's very interesting, and it's very noticing. I mean, he notices when they're there, when they're gone, and all the other things about my bodily comportment, my tone of voice. So autism is not just the kind of aloneness and lack of response to other people that we think it is. It's a lack of ability to interact theoretically. But there's an awful lot more than that if we would allow for it.
This lack of ability to interact theoretically is a theme we could be unpacking here for another 2 hours, I think. But we've done 2 hours already, and I think this is a good place for us to conclude. Please tell us, where can people find you? Where are you posting? Do you have any social media channels that they can follow?
So I don't have any of, this, I don't have a link to me. Which I don't know, I just don't. But I do publish articles, and for the most part now, I publish with Brownstone Institute in the States and Off Guardian in England, and they're my two favorite places to be. um, and then other than that, I mean, yeah, I know everybody does have online presence, but I don't. And I hate the idea of it, just the practicalities of it. And as to the book, you see, this is more of it, because I've now decided I'm going to self-publish, but this is going to be gargantuan task. And I stare at what's required and I feel total nihilism. So the answer is I don't know. I mean, but soon, I hope. There you go.
That's fair enough. What we're going to do is send the audience to your Brownstone landing page where they can find a catalogue of all your published articles. And I think that's a good start to get acquainted with how you think about things. As for the book, I sincerely hope you're going to publish it pretty soon. It is an utterly fascinating piece of work. I really enjoyed reading it. I loved learning from it. And your take on so many things is so original.
Oh my God.
I just absolutely loved it. It was very educational. It was highly informative. So I hope you will get it over the line pretty soon. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for bringing so much wisdom to this interview. Really, really appreciate it. All the best for the future. Good luck with the book, and please make sure you keep in touch.
Yes, well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate your interest in it.
That is it for today. This was Sinead Murphy discussing both her Brownstone editorial and her upcoming book titled Autistic Society Disorder. Now, I don't really know when this book is actually coming out exactly, but it definitely will be this year in 2024. I think it will be around Q3. Once the book does come out, I will update the show notes section and include a link to where you can procure a copy, because if you are interested in the themes we've discussed here today, I am telling you, you will find this book amazingly informative and quite original in its form. To sign off, I'm going to quote a couple of sentences from Sinead's Autistic Society Disorder, from a chapter that talks about care, about what care is today, what it used to be, and what it needs to be to once more become real, authentic, and human. And here's the quote: "Far from being available for the distinctions, the labels, the concepts, the signals that are the currency of our institutions, the learning, living, and loving for which we sadly substitute education, health, and care are not even distinguishable from each other. When we do care about what is going on, we learn. When we can care about what is going on, we are alive. When we care and are cared for, we love and are loved. All, in the end, is care, and care is the opposite of Autistic Society Disorder. As always, thank you very much for your attention today, and I'm hoping to see you next time."